We're going to now start our second lecture in this unit that goes from 1754-ish to about 1800. So this lecture is looking at the causes of the revolution. It's mostly going to go from the 1760s through the 1770s, and it's going to lead us right up to the revolution. It'll be done in two parts. So let's look here at this slide that we have. So we have on the right-hand side this political cartoon, and you see this Native American woman. And at this time, typically, a Native American woman was supposed to represent the colonies, like this new world person. On the left-hand side, excuse me, we see this woman, she's supposed to represent England. And so in this picture, we see that the colonies are saying, "Liberty, liberty, forever, Mother England, while I exist." And Mother England is saying, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." So pretty strong words here, right? And so this kind of encapsulates this lecture, right? We're going to see the colonies start to get more and more angry and more rebellious, and Mother England is going to start to clamp down harsher and harsher on the colonies. And it's all about this interplay between the two, the Mother England and the colonies. So what we have here is right after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. We had said in our previous lecture, in lecture 1 of this series, that England was in debt from the war. And England has been through several wars, and they realize that they are going to have to start taxing their colonies because they're 140 million pounds in debt. And so they're like, okay, so we need money or England's going to go bankrupt. And it's like, well, in previous years, we've taxed the people of England. But they're tapped out, right? The people of England have been taxed a lot over the previous years for the previous wars. And so they know that they can't raise taxes on the people in England anymore because there might be rebellions and there's poverty, and so forget it. We can't do it. So we have to look for a new revenue stream, a new people to tax, and of course that's the colonies. And the reason, we had said before, and we'll say it again, that the reason they think, oh, let's tax the colonies is because the colonies are going to they benefited from the French and Indian War. Before the French and Indian War, this whole area here was French, but when the war is over, at the peace table, the French have to totally leave the New World here in North America. And so this all becomes, from the Mississippi River east, right, this all becomes English possession, which means that the French are no longer a threat. So if you're a colonist living in the New World, you're safer now because the French aren't right next door to you. The French are not giving the Native Americans guns, so you're safer in that way too. And so Mother England said, well, the colonies benefited from this war, so isn't it fair that they pay for some of the cost of the war? And that's why we can tax them. So the person in charge of this, the Prime Minister of England right now, is a guy by the name of George Grenville. And George Grenville, he is the one really saying we need to pay off our debts. And so he says, let's tax the colonies. So we've talked about on the previous slide why they figure they need to tax the colonies, and they figure it's fair to tax the colonies. But here's another reason, right? So in the past, we've talked about this concept of mercantilism, that's the idea that all the wealth in the world can be put into a pie chart, basically. And over here we have England, and this may be France, right? And maybe over here is Spain. And if France gets wealthier, then that means that their pie piece gets bigger, right? So here's our new pie piece. But what does that mean? That means if France gets wealthier, then England must get less wealthy and less powerful, because if one piece gets bigger, the other piece has to shrink. And that's the idea of mercantilism. It creates this idea of competition. And so during the French and Indian War, while we're fighting the French, the colonies, a lot of them were illegally smuggling goods to the French, the whole people we're fighting against, because the colonists are like, well, you know, I understand this is a war, but I want to make money. And so tobacco farmers were smuggling tobacco to the French government or to the French colonies in the Caribbean, or South Carolina rice farmers were illegally smuggling rice to the French Caribbean in Haiti to feed their slaves because they were getting paid more than the British would pay them. And so the French were like, the English were like, this isn't right, right? Our colonies should not be making the Empire of France France wealthier by illegally trading with them, and that hurts England, both in wartime and it makes our pie piece smaller, our money, our power smaller. And so we need to crack down on this. We need money and we need to control those darn colonies' trade, because this is not working out for the benefit of Mother England. And so here we see this really important idea that the colonies' interests are not necessarily the same as Mother England's interests. The colonies want to make as much money as possible and trade with whoever will give them the biggest price, right, for their goods. England, though, no. The colonies have to trade with only us, right, because it's all about making Mother England richer, increasing our pie piece. And so we had talked in previous lectures about the Navigation Acts that were passed in 1651, but hadn't really been enforced for a brief time during the Dominion of New England, but for the most part haven't been enforced on the colonies. It's been an era of neglect where Mother England kind of ignores the colonies and doesn't have to make them pay taxes and doesn't control their trade. But George Grenville says that has to end now, right? We're going to make the colonies pay their fair share, and we're going to make sure that the colonies trade with only who we want them to trade with, because we believe in mercantilism. We believe that we're going to control their money and their trade to make Mother England's pie piece bigger and not smaller. And so both of these reasons, for slide 1 and slide 2, we see that England decides to crack down on the colonies and really get more involved, ending the era of salutary neglect, or neglecting the colonies. So what do they do first, right? So we see in 1764, right after the end of the French and Indian War, England is going to start this new taxation policy. And so this first tax is called the Sugar Act. Obviously, it taxes sugar. Now, in the past, in 1733, England did have a tax on the colonies as far as sugar goes. It was called the Molasses Act, and it charged the colonies a tax of 6 cents a gallon of molasses, which is kind of a liquid form of sugar. And they said, okay, you're going to have to pay this. But it was during an era of neglect, and even though England passed the law, they never really enforced the law. So they never collected their 6 cents a gallon, and the colonists never paid the 6 cents a gallon, because England was kind of content to just neglect the colonies. But now we know things are different after the French and Indian War. England needs money. And so we're going to pass the Sugar Act, which says that we will now collect 3 cents a gallon. And England thinks, well, how can the colonies be upset about this? We're actually lowering their taxes. So from the English viewpoint, the colonies should not protest. But from the colonies' viewpoint, well, they never paid the tax, the Molasses Act, before, so they didn't pay any taxes. And now England is actually going to enforce a tax, and it's 3 cents a gallon. So from the colonies' viewpoint, if you follow this, their taxes just went up 3 cents, not down 3 cents. And so we have two different people who are looking at this issue from two completely different sides. England thinks it's a good tax that's fair. The colonists think that it's not a good tax that is raising their taxes. And so we're going to have some friction over this. Right? So what this is, it's known as an external tax. So let's talk about where this tax is going to get collected. So England over here, they're the ones shipping the molasses to or from the sugar to or from the colonies. And so let's say these boats pull up to the Boston Harbor or wherever, and they're loaded with sugar. And then as the boat unloads their sugar off the docks to some Boston merchant who's going to sell that sugar in his store, at the docks, the Boston merchant has to pay the tax, or else he can't get the sugar. So this is called an external tax because it's taxed at the port. It's not taxed inside the colonies in their stores, but it's taxed by the merchant at the port. Well, if you're a good merchant, right, what you're going to do is you're not happy about paying this extra tax on your sugar you're importing, but you'll just pass that tax on to the customers. But the customers aren't really aware of this. They just know that yesterday they went to the store to buy sugar, and then today they go to the store to buy sugar, and for some reason it's up 3 cents. They don't actually see the tax. The customers are not paying the tax, it's the merchant. And so there's not as much people in the colonies upset about this tax as there will be about future taxes, because really the only people that actually see the tax directly are the merchants. The vast majority, 90+%, right, the majority of the colonists don't see it. They just know their food prices have went up, their sugar prices have went up, but they don't know why. And so there's some grousing about this, there's some anger from the merchants, but the majority of the colonies, they're not really as affected by this directly. And so we're going to see that there's not as much protest to the Sugar Act for this reason. right? So, but the merchants, let's focus on the merchants now. So they are upset, and they start to write England, and they start to grumble to each other because, like, what is England doing? They're taxing us, and we've been in a period of neglect before. England has left us alone, and so that's one they're mad about. All of a sudden, Mom cares about us, and she's taking money out of her pocket, and so that's kind of making you angry. But another reason is because this is the very first time in the colony's history, for the most part, where England has passed a tax that's just out and out to get money, right, for revenue. And it's not for controlling trade. So merchants understood that we're part of an empire. We understand that England stretches across the Atlantic and around the world. And Parliament, the government in England, has the power to kind of regulate trade for the benefit of the entire empire. And so, okay, we get that. But just to out and out pass a tax to collect money off of us? No. That's something new. That's crossing a new threshold. And so anytime there's something new, people get upset about it. And so the merchants in Boston and Charleston and any port you can think of in Philadelphia and New York, they get mad about this because it's a little bit harder to sell their sugar because now the prices have gone up, and that's going to cost them money. Now, enforcement, right? If you pass a tax or a law and you don't enforce it, well, it's not really a law, is it? And so enforcement of this is going to be difficult because, let's say we have this merchant here, and he illegally gets sugar from somebody else besides the English, or he unloads the boat, but he doesn't pay the tax. And so, of course, we have tax collectors and people who work for the government that are supposed to investigate this and watch him. And so let's say our merchant here, right? He is caught for not paying the tax or illegally trading to get sugar from the French West Indies or the Spanish West Indies and just not paying the English tax. And so he's going to be arrested, and he's going to go to a court in Boston or in Philadelphia, and you get a right to a jury by a trial of your peers. And so the people that are going to be finding out if he's guilty or not are his fellow colonists who don't like the tax either. They don't want to pay more for their sugar. And so invariably, even if the merchant is totally guilty of not paying this tax and got caught red-handed, his fellow colonists are going to say, not guilty, because they don't like the tax and they don't want to pay more for their sugar. And so it was really hard to enforce this new tax because the juries were always finding the merchants not guilty, even if they were. And so England's like, we got to fix this, right? We got to make sure that this doesn't happen. And so England is going to create a new court system in America. It's based on a military court system. It's called admiralty courts, right? And so an admiralty court is when an American colonist merchant is arrested for not paying the tax. So instead of going to a courtroom with a jury of their peers, their fellow colonists, no, they're going to go into a military courtroom. And that judge is going to be employed and paid for by the king and parliament. And of course he's going to find the merchant guilty because king and parliament like this tax, they're his bosses, they pay him, and so boom, all of a sudden guilty. And so, right, so that's how we enforce it. But think about if you're an American colonist. You've just had your court system taken away from you, right? A cherished right, there are two cherished rights of every Englishman, doesn't matter where you live in the English Empire. You have the right to elect people to decide whether they tax you or not. It's called taxation with representation. And if you don't like taxes, you can vote them out of office and vote for somebody who's going to lower your taxes. So that's a cherished English right. More about that in a minute. The other right Englishmen have is they have a right to a trial by a jury of their peers. It makes people have a fair legal system, that there's not some dictator, some evil person that's going to just arrest people and automatically send them to jail. No, your fellow citizens will determine your guilt or innocence. And the English have just done away with that, with these admiralty courts. And so this is going to get the colonists mad because it looks like they're losing control of their judicial branch of government. So let's now go to the next year, and we're going to see the Stamp Act. And I'm going to put a star by this because this is even more important than the Sugar Act. This is always something that comes up when you're studying this time in history. And so what is it, and why is it going to have such a huge impact on colonial history? Well, so the Sugar Act, as we can see, was not really raising much revenue because people are smuggling, or before the Admiralty courts were getting caught but getting released. And so England's like, we need a bigger tax. We need something that's going to tax not just sugar, but a lot of stuff that people use on a day-to-day basis. That's really going to make the money roll in to pay off England's debts. And so that's the Stamp Act in 1765. That's a date to know. It's a pivotal act. And so this is a tax on paper products that are used for some kind of official or legal purpose. And so if you have a contract that you're gonna, you have a contract to buy something from somebody, or rent, or anything like that, a marriage contract or whatever, right? You put it down on a piece of paper and it makes it official. Well, now with this new law, the paper, it's only going to be official, not if people sign it, not if it's witnessed by somebody, but if it has a government stamp making it official. And so here we see a picture of a stamp right here. And so if you're a lawyer, your whole career, everything you do every day is involving wills and licenses and contracts for business, and all of that. The price of all of that business is now going to go up because you now have to pay a tax on top of that. And so this is really going to hurt lawyers' businesses. And so this is going to make lawyers angry, right? And so think about it. We all go through every day having to deal with the law, and we have conflicts with other people, and we do legal documents in business. And so this is going to affect a lot of people, not just merchants at the dock like the Sugar Act did. Right? If you have a will, let's say that you die and you have a will. For that will to be valid, it's got to have a stamp on it. And so we see that a lot of people are going to be impacted by this. Next thing we see, newspapers, right? Newspapers are made from paper, or at least they used to be. And so if you wanted to be able to buy a newspaper, it has to have the stamp on it, or it's an illegal newspaper. And back then, people in America, a lot of people, especially in New England, were very literate, and they read the newspaper all the time. It was a big deal. Everybody read newspapers every day. And so this is going to make them angry because their daily news is now taxed. And so we're going to see that the people who own newspapers, their business goes down because people don't want to have to pay more for their newspaper. Fine, I just won't buy a newspaper today. And so we've made enemy of two of the most influential people in the colonies: lawyers, who are educated and well-spoken and tend to be politicians, and newspaper owners, who can control public opinion by what they write in the newspaper. And so as we're going to see in a minute, those are the people that really protest against the Stamp Act and get other people to support them as well. Even playing cards, because they're made out of paper, they're going to be taxed as well. And so don't tax my gambling, right? And so this is going to affect, the point is going to affect a whole bunch of people, not just one group of people, merchants at the port. Here's the next reason it makes people angry. If you remember on the previous slide, the Sugar Act was an external tax. It's only assessed at the port, and so your average everyday person in the colonies didn't see it because they're not going to the port to buy something for their store. But here, everybody will see it. It's what we call an internal tax. It's not assessed at the port by a merchant. It's assessed inside the colonies, at stores, at the newspaper stand, at the lawyer's office, at the gambling parlor if you want to, have this deck of cards to make it legal. And so it affects a much wider group of people, and you actually physically see it because you see the stamp. That's proof the tax has been paid. And so if this new tax is in your face, it's an actual stamp. It's not some kind of economic theory that it's attached at the port and maybe we understand it, maybe we don't. No. We understand it. We can see the tax. And so this is going to create a lot of people to be very angry about the Stamp Act. And so our next slide or two is about opposition to the Stamp Act, because as I've tried to make the point, more people are going to see the Stamp Act, be affected by the Stamp Act. It's going to impact leaders in the colonies who are upset at it. And so we're going to see a lot more opposition to the Stamp Act, right? And so here is yet another reason people oppose the Stamp Act. It's because it impinges on one of your rights as an English citizen, the right to taxation with representation. So let's take a look at this diagram, right? If you're an English citizen living in England, right, what you have here is what you have here is in England, you vote for politicians. And so these politicians, it's representative democracy. They pass laws, create taxes, run the government. And if those members of parliament are doing a bad job, well, then when it's time to vote again, you vote them out of office because you don't like that they raised your taxes or passed some law. And so representative democracy is the idea that the people themselves control their government through their representatives. And if taxes are too high, well, we're going to vote them out of office. That is a cherished right of every Englishman. It doesn't matter if you live in England or if you live over here in the colonies, right? If we live over here in the colonies, they're both English citizens. But now we have a difference, is because if you're a colonist, you're an Englishman living in the colonies, you don't get to vote for Parliament. There's never, none of the colonies have ever been able to elect somebody to go all the way to Parliament. It just didn't happen. And so now, if England passes a tax on you, and you don't like it, like the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act, you have no recourse. You have no way to say, no, stop passing taxes on me, because you don't vote for Parliament. And so this is taking away a cherished British right, that you have the right to taxation with representation. You can control the government. And so we start to see people in the Americas do that famous phrase, no taxation without representation. And so now we understand what that means, right? And so people think that their rights are being taken away. So let's take a moment and talk about this concept of rights. Well, at this time in Europe, there's this philosophical movement going on called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is this idea that people are born with natural rights, that when you're born, you have the right to your life, and nobody should be able to kill you and take that away from you, not even the government. You have the right to your freedom or liberty, right? The government can't throw you in jail for no reason. You have a right to a trial by a jury of your peers. We've already seen how England took that away in the colonies. And you have the right to your money, right? The government just can't come and take away your money and ruin you. You have a say in it, which means you get to vote people who pass laws, who pass taxes. And so now we see that these Enlightenment ideas are being taken away. Now, the Enlightenment is a European movement, but the idea of it and the beliefs of it, of course, are going to come to the colonies as people move to the colonies from England. So this is yet another example of Anglicization, the idea that the colonies are heavily influenced and copy the culture and the ideas and the philosophy of Mother England. And when these are being broken, right, the taxation without representation, we feel angry. We feel that our natural rights are being denied to us, and who are they to do that to us? And so even more anger. Right? Now, Parliament responds with this argument of no taxation without representation, and Parliament uses the idea of virtual representation, right? And so here that is here. Virtual representation is the idea. They say, England says, well, look, you colonists don't get to vote for us in Parliament because you're too far away and whatever, but the members of Parliament, we have your interest at heart. You're virtually represented. You don't get to directly be represented because you don't vote for us, but trust us. We are doing what's good for the entire empire, so trust us. Well, the colonists are not going to believe that because they're not going to trust Parliament because they clearly pass these taxes without thinking about how we feel about it. And since we don't vote for Parliament, we have no way of showing you our displeasure, of stopping this. We can't vote you out of office. So the colonists reject the idea of virtual representation as insulting. Right? Now, I've already said that this internal tax is going to affect influential groups, people that are leaders that can get people riled up in the colonies. And we said that was lawyers and newspaper owners. In both of those cases, these are influential people that are educated and can control public opinion. And they're going to be the most heavily financially impacted by the Stamp Act, as we've said. And so we're going to see them leading opposition to the Stamp Act. So, more opposition to the Stamp Act continues. So, who are the opposition groups? So, we've already said that the leaders are going to be newspaper owners and they're going to be lawyers. And then from the Sugar Act, we have these rich merchants who are also upset about the taxes. So, those are the elite of colonial society. But what about if we go down the social structure? Are middle-class people as upset about this? Are lower-class people as upset about this? And the answer is yes. Because the lower class people and the middle class people, they have to pay now more for their sugar, and they're going to have to pay now more for their wills and their business contracts and their receipts, because a receipt is a piece of paper that's only now valid if you have a stamp. And so they're being hit by this in the pocketbook too. And so their leaders, the merchants and the lawyers and the newspaper owners are saying, get upset about this. And so the rank and file, the people that will actually be carrying the signs and protesting, and as we'll see, doing some more violent protesting, The masses of the mob, if you will, are going to be the middle class artisans and the lower class laborers, common laborers. And they play a big part as kind of the rank and file of the mobs, and the elite are leading those mobs, those angry groups of people. So this is really a multi-class movement in America, not just the upper class. So we have this group called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty are this, for lack of a better term, mob, this angry group of people who are the middle and lower classes that are very upset with what is going on, that their rights are being taken away. And they're being egged on and led by the upper class, the lawyers and the merchants and the newspaper owners. And so the Sons of Liberty is created, right? The Sons of Freedom, the Sons of Liberty. And this is a group of people, and you can see on the right-hand side here, who are going to use some pretty vicious tactics, some pretty angry tactics, physical tactics to get people to get rid of this tax, to let people know in England that we're upset about this. So that's the Sons of Liberty. And over here we see this group of Sons of Liberty. You can see this guy is a lower class guy. He's got this cudgel. He's a dock worker, and this is something you might use on the docks, right? This guy might be a tea merchant, and this guy might be a minister or something. This guy might be a leader. And so what they've done is they've grabbed the tax collector who's supposed to collect the Stamp Act, and they've abducted him, and they've stripped him naked, and they've rolled him in really hot tar to burn his skin because, we're trying to harm these tax collectors. And then they roll him in feathers just to make him look silly and ridiculous and embarrass him. Well, tarring and feathering could kill you because your whole skin is now covered and burned, and so your skin has to be able to breathe. And if you try to take the tar off, a lot of times it'll take your skin off with it. And so this is not quite a death sentence, but sometimes it is, to be tarred and feathered. And it's humiliating in front of your friends and family and colleagues and the people in your community. And here they're pouring tea, hot, scalding tea down his throat. And we'll talk about why they do that later. It's part of another government act in the future. Look at the tree behind him. It's nicknamed the Liberty Tree by this political cartoonist. And it's the Stamp Act. Liberty means freedom, right? And we're going to hang this guy, and we're going to kill him, perhaps, by hanging him from the Tree of Freedom. So it's very symbolic. And you can't see it very well, but it says Stamp Act upside down. So if you put something upside down, that's a form of protesting it, right? We hate this. We want it to die. And so we see that the Sons of Liberty are a very physical, middle and lower class group of people that are going to violently, physically protest against the Stamp Act. All right, so the elite are leading that, but also the elite will meet and have these big congresses. Congress means meeting, where the educated elite, the richest people in the colony, will try to get together and try to coordinate an intercolonial response to this. Because remember, we have said that each colony kind of views themselves as separately. They have different histories, different economies, different religious groups. And so here we see an example of growing colonial unity. As the colonies are all being impacted by this law, they're going to start to come together. And this is the trend we see. The more England tries to control and clamp down on the colonies, the more it forces the colonists together in their anger. And we're going to see growing colonial unity as we go through this lecture. And so 9 colonies show up out of 13. Now, if you remember during the French and Indian War, when they had the Albany Congress to come together to plan their defense against the French and Indians, only 7 colonies showed up. But now we have 2 more. And so over time in the next meeting, we're going to have 12 colonies. And then in the next one, we're going to have 13 colonies. And so, again, the more England tries to clamp down on us, the more the colonies come together for protest. On the bottom here, we see another form of protest. It's not as maybe spectacular and violent as this picture over here on the right, but this is also a form of protest. And so the newspaper owner who owns the Pennsylvania Journal, right, he is going to sell his newspaper, by God, and he doesn't care if England says you can't sell it without the stamp. And so if you look over here in the corner, it says that this is where the stamp is supposed to go. But the newspaper owner said, I'm selling it without the stamp, I'm protesting, and I think the stamp should die. The Stamp Act should die. And so that's why he has the skull and crossbones here. And so by publishing the newspaper and selling it without the stamp, you're breaking the law and you're happy about it, right? You're telling people, I don't care, we should all break this law. And if you buy the newspaper without the stamp, you're breaking the law. And so people bought up these newspapers left and right to show that we are in opposition to this, we don't care about this, we don't like it, it should go away. So lots of protest. Now, the Stamp Act Congress, so as I was saying, there are 9 colonies that are going to come together and try to plan out what to do about this tax. And so, of course, these educated super colonial elite are going to, they decide, we're going to write a letter to the king and parliament, and we're going to say, look, in all politeness, dear king and parliament, we don't believe in these laws. It's breaking our cherished English rights of representation and taxation, and we think it's wrong. And so they're going to give politely worded letters, a list of grievances, and see if the king and parliament will pay attention to them. They don't. But we're going to try to do this peaceful. So we see some unpeaceful, some not peaceful protest, and we see some peaceful protest. All right. The next thing the Stamp Act Congress does is they try to organize what we call non-importation agreements. In other words, boycotts. And so all up and down the 9 colonies, and even some that don't come to the Stamp Act Congress, we try to get people, using peer pressure, we try to get people to not buy anything made in England. Doesn't matter if it's made, if it's this paper or whatever, anything, right? Whether it's tea or dresses or pianos or chandeliers or champagne, anything, right? Anything made or transported to us from England, we are going to boycott and not buy. We're going to make our own shirts. We're going to make our own dresses. We're going to make everything our own. And the reason we're doing this is because we believe that if violent protest doesn't work and peaceful protest doesn't work, people pay attention to money. And so by this point, the colonies are one of England's biggest customers to buy things made in England. And if we all of a sudden stop buying stuff from them, that's going to destroy England's economy. And England is going to be like, oh, shoot, what have we done? We can't have our economy falter, and they'll pay attention to us. Now, in order for this to work, we have to get women on our side because it's a very patriarchal society, male-dominated society in the colonies, and women are expected to cook and clean and to take care of the household. And that also means going and buying food. That also means going and buying clothing and materials and dresses and shopping for the home. And so if we really want to boycott British goods, we have to get women to support this boycott because they're the major purchasers of these goods from England. And so women did. And so here's a great example of how opposition to the Stamp Act was not just all classes of men, but we also see it was also women that was involved in the protest as well. So this totally works. Of all of these things, right, the most important one is the boycott. Now, people were not buying things, not only because they thought it was their patriotic duty to stand up for their Enlightenment rights, but also if you went and bought something, the Sons of Liberty might come visit you at your home and say, we heard that you just bought a dress from some store that got their stuff from England. You're not supporting the colonies. You should probably rethink that. And of course, there's a veiled threat there. Sometimes not so veiled, that next time you buy something from England and don't support the boycott, you might be tarred and feathered. We might throw rocks through your windows. So this is pretty serious peer pressure by the Sons of Liberty. And so because of the Stamp Act Congress, because of the Sons of Liberty, the letters of protest, and primarily because of the boycott, England is like, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't do this. Now, England's not happy about it. They still need their money from the colonies. But the people of England are upset with their own parliament because the economy of England is starting to falter, because their number one customer was the colonies to buy English goods. So in England, people are having a tough time selling their stuff, they're laying off workers, they're putting pressure on their elected parliament members to get rid of this tax. It's hurting our economy here in England. And so England's like, okay, and they passed the Declaratory Act. Now notice the Stamp Act was in 1765. And then the Declaratory Act is in the same year, just at the end of the year. And so the Declaratory Act says, okay, we declare that we are going to get rid of the Stamp Act. You can hear the colonists rejoicing at this point. They're like, yay, that's awesome. Mother England cares about us. They listened to us. We had to protest. We had to get a little violent, but they finally listened to us, and so we're very excited. And so the act is gone. And so we see in this picture, right, this is a funeral procession. It's a political cartoon. And they're about to go bury somebody. And look at who they're burying. They're burying this little tiny child's coffin. And that's so sad, but it's not a child. It is the Stamp Act. Why is the Stamp Act in this little coffin? Because it wasn't even a year old. And so we see that all of these members of Parliament are going to bury this dead act. And so we're celebrating. We're like, yeah, you know, this stupid, unpopular law is going away. It's dead and buried. All right. So that's the first half of the Declaratory Act. We're going to get rid of the Stamp Act. But the second half of the Declaratory Act that gives it its name is that England says, Parliament says, even though we're getting rid of the Stamp Act, we declare that we have the right to pass future taxes on the colonies. We will get rid of the Stamp Act because you guys don't like it, but that doesn't mean we are giving up our right to tax the colonies. We're Mother England, we're in charge, and we can tax the colonies anytime we want. So colonies, don't think you've won, right? We still have the right to do this. We'll just tax you in a different way that we'll still get our money, and you stupid colonists aren't going to figure it out because we're going to do it in a different way. More about that in a future part to this lecture. Now, if you're the colonists, you only hear what you want to hear. You hear the first part of the Declaratory Act, the Stamp Act is gone, and then you stop paying attention. But this is foreshadowing things to come, because even though the Stamp Act is gone, England says they can pass new taxes in the future. They have the right, and they will do that. So let's look at the learning objectives here. These are things that you should really think of and know and take from this lecture. First, it says analyze the reasons for the end of the era of salutary neglect. And again, that's just a fancy term for England ignoring the colonies. And so we had said, again, that England is going to ignore the colonies until the French and Indian War is over. And at that point, England needs money. And so they're going to have to start to pay attention to the colonies to get money from the colonies. And that's the basic answer of the reason that is going away, the era of neglect. Number two, in what ways did England attempt to raise revenue from the colonies? And so we talked about the Sugar Act and we talked about the Stamp Act. They were different ways to try to get money. One was an external tax, one was an internal tax. Neither one was effective. Both of them are going to create protests, but the most protests that we talked about is the Stamp Act. Number three, describe the various arguments the colonies used against English taxation. And this is primarily the idea of no taxation without representation that we covered. It's also the idea that England is taking away our Enlightenment freedoms and our Enlightenment rights. We have a right to control our government. We have a right to have the government not take away our money. And so that's the gist of that question. For number four, it says identify the political and economic actions the colonists took to protest English taxation. And so we just talked about that. We talked about peaceful protests, selling newspapers without the stamp. We talked about the Stamp Act Congress, of sending lists of grievances to England to get them to stop. We talked about the boycotts, trying to get England to pay attention to us and repeal the act because we're not buying their goods. We also talked about violent protest and the Sons of Liberty, who were using violence and peer pressure to get people to support the colonists and not Mother England. And so these are all examples of these protests against English taxation. And then the last one we have, it says, to what extent were the colonies united in their opposition to English taxation by 1765? And so the answer to that is more united. Not completely united, but we said in the Stamp Act Congress, 9 colonies joined. That's not all 13, but it's certainly more than we've seen before when we just had 7 during the Albany Congress. And we made the point that the more England pushes down on the colonists and oppresses them, the more it drives these 13 children, these 13 colonies together to protest against Mother England. And so that's it for part 1 of our lecture. In part 2, we're going to talk about the second wave of English taxes after the Declaratory Act.